Hi everyone, we left off talking about exclusivism and the way that it's rooted in a principle of evidence, and we talked about what that principle was. The principle of evidence is this: if two people have the same evidence, and if one of them accepts a certain proposition, and the other accepts its denial, at least one of them is not rational. The idea is that belief is supposed to be guided by evidence. If you're a rational believer, one of the principles of being a rational believer is that you allow your beliefs to be formed in light of the evidence. So a rational believer believes things in light of the evidence. So if two rational believers have the same evidence, they should form the same belief. So if two people have access to the same evidence and they form contradictory beliefs, then at least one of them must be irrational. So that's the principle of evidence. And according to this principle, weak exclusivism entails strong exclusivism. Weak exclusivism is this view that the view that you're committed to is logically inconsistent with other views, and it's rational for you to believe it. Therefore, it must be the case that the views that it's logically inconsistent with are false in some respect. And strong exclusivism adds the claim that not only are those views false, but anyone who has access to the evidence that you have is irrational if they believe in those views. So, for example, if Jane believes P and Jim believes not P, and they share the same total evidence, each must consider the other somehow irrational, because rational people believe on the basis of evidence, and if they both have the same evidence, they should have the same belief, unless one of them is somehow irrational. So what is the consequence of this argument, right? This kind of exclusivism based on this type of evidence, or principle of evidence? Say you're a philosopher who accepts ism. Ism is some view like materialism, phenomenalism, nominalism, whatever. And there are other philosophers who accept nism, which is the denial of ism, right? Nism is short for not ism. If you accept the argument that Van Inwagen has made thus far, then one of the following things must be true. Either it's not rational for you to accept ism, it's not rational for a trained philosopher to accept nism, or some trained philosophers who accept nism are in epistemic circumstances that are inferior to yours, or philosophers who accept nism are less intelligent than you are in some respect. Van Inwagen finds all of these conclusions unattractive, and he gives an example of why he thinks this is such an unattractive conclusion. He talks about a philosopher named David Lewis and a long, sort of protracted disagreement they had about the issue of free will. And Van Inwagen's point is basically David Lewis was a genius. David Lewis was aware of all of the evidence on the issue of free will. Van Inwagen also was exceptionally brilliant as a philosopher. So he says, none of these conclusions are acceptable if you think about it in terms of that ongoing disagreement between Lewis and Van Inwagen. It's not the case that it's irrational for one of them to be committed to their view. It's not the case that one of them is ignorant of some of the evidence. And it's not the case that one of them is less intelligent, right? Or at least it's not likely that that's the case. So Van Inwagen says the argument thus far takes us to a place that we don't want to accept, and he refuses to accept it. Here's what he says. There's an alternative. So the principle of evidence that we've been talking about understands evidence as something that is essentially public, something out there for everyone to see. But Van Inwagen says, what if there's a special kind of evidence, a kind of evidence that is interior, incommunicable, right? Something that is interior to you and something that you can't make public, something you can't export and put into words, right? So if evidence isn't essentially public, then it's possible for two people to have access to the same public evidence and to still disagree without being irrational because one of them has access to some kind of interior evidence. And he gives some examples of what this kind of evidence might be. He says, sometimes I know when my wife is angry when no one else does. And I can't pinpoint. He says, I can't pinpoint what it is that allows me to make that determination, but I know it anyway. So it's not publicly available knowledge, but it's evidence. He says there are also intuitive mathematicians. Mathematicians say they have this sense that some proposition, some mathematical proposition is true, but they can't put it in words or articulate it. And then they go on to discover that the mathematical proposition is true. And he says, so that looks like a kind of interior, incommunicable evidence. And he also gives the example of the chicken sexer, and this is a favorite example in the philosophy of science. Apparently, there are people who work in the poultry industry who can determine the sex of chicks upon their emergence from an egg and can sort them into male and female in a reliable way. But they can't put into words precisely how they managed to make that distinction. That's an interesting case, and that sounds like it might be, again, interior, incommunicable evidence. So this is where Van Inwagen ends up, and he himself is really not happy with his conclusions. He recognizes this, that making evidence interior and incommunicable in this way sounds kind of like irrationalism. And he recognizes also that intuitions are notoriously bad at tracking the truth. And so if you turn evidence into a kind of interior state or a kind of intuition, then you run the risk of everyone just having these disagreements and then claiming to have superior intuitions. And so you get people, I think, you get people begging the question again in a way that is really unsatisfactory. And so Van Inwagen ends by saying, "Here I confess my predicament. As a philosopher who holds particular views, as a citizen who casts his vote according to the dictates of certain political beliefs, as an adherent of one religion among many, I am unwilling to become an agnostic about everything but empirically verifiable matters of fact. But I can't answer for this." So he says, I'm not satisfied with any of the possibilities. I'm not satisfied with the 4 possibilities that are the case if the principle of evidence is correct. And he says, I'm also not satisfied with this notion of interior evidence. But one wonders, if Van Inwagen isn't satisfied with these outcomes, one wonders why he doesn't endorse fallibilism. He doesn't mention it. But why not endorse the view that I believe that I know some things, but I recognize that it's in principle possible that I might be wrong?